when borders began to burn, war did not arrive with a single front. It spread. Rathmir's ashes had barely cooled when the first clashes erupted along borders that had been quiet for generations. Patrols met patrols in disputed valleys. Fleets shadowed one another across narrow seas. Watchtowers burned, not always by dragonfire, but by hands eager to strike before being struck. The world had crossed an invisible line. In Valhem, Arion Balther received reports faster than his scribes could record them. Each message told a different story, yet all carried the same undertone. Restraint was failing. A southern lord accused a neighbor of conspiring with dragons. A western port seized ships for inspection and never returned them. A northern pass erupted into bloodshed after a single arrow. No one agreed who loosed it. Arion read every account, jaw tight, crown untouched. "This is not strategy," he said to his generals. "This is panic." Yet panic had momentum, and momentum, once gained, was difficult to stop. Against his instinct, Arion ordered limited mobilization, not for conquest, but deterrence. Valhem's banners moved to its borders for the first time in living memory. The sight alone sent shockwaves through nearby realms. If Valhem prepared for war, then war was inevitable. South of the plains, Lyrian Vale watched villages evacuate before any army appeared. People no longer waited for proof. Rumor was enough. Smoke on the horizon meant flight. A delayed caravan meant betrayal. The mere mention of dragons could empty a town by nightfall. Lyrian guided those she could, but the roads grew crowded and dangerous. Armed groups demanded tolls. Soldiers pressed travelers for information. Lines blurred between protection and predation. One village refused to leave. "They'll burn us either way," an elder said. "At least here, we die on our land." Lyrian stayed the night. At dawn, the village still stood. By dusk it was gone, not by dragonfire, but by soldiers from a neighboring realm who feared it would shelter enemies. Fire did not always come from the sky. In the east, Elmira, Nox traced the spreading instability through patterns only she could see. Ley lines flared erratically across the continent, reacting not only to dragon movement, but to mass fear and bloodshed. Magic fed on imbalance, and imbalance now saturated the world. She realized with growing dread that even if the dragons withdrew, the war would not end. The world itself had become volatile. Elmira sent word to Valhem, warning that the conflict was awakening forces older than any crown. She did not know if the message arrived before the roads closed. In the west, Tharek Ironblood launched his first true campaign. He framed it as protection, securing vulnerable territories before dragonfire could reach them. His armies advanced with speed and discipline, absorbing smaller forces rather than destroying them. Those who resisted were crushed swiftly. Those who submitted were spared. Efficiency bred loyalty, or something close enough. Tharek understood that while dragons reshaped the sky, men still decided the ground. Above burning valleys and fractured coastlines, Kaldrix moved rarely, but his presence was felt everywhere, a shadow crossing clouds, heat rising without flame, silence falling before battles. Entire armies froze at the rumor of his approach. Some fled. Others prayed. A few prepared traps that would never be tested. Kaldrix did not strike at random. He targeted moments, places where fear had already done most of the work, where a single flame would unravel entire regions. Each strike accelerated the war, and in the widening chaos, the Veiled One adjusted nothing. The world no longer required guidance. Borders burned, trust collapsed, and the war, once contained to rumor and flame, now marched openly across the realms. Fire was everywhere. Fronts without names by the time the first formal declarations were written. The war had already outpaced them. Battles erupted in places no general had marked as strategic. Hills that had never known blood ran dark with it. Rivers clogged with the wreckage of bridges hastily destroyed by both sides. The war no longer followed borders, it followed fear. In the south, 3 realms collided in a single week. What began as a defensive maneuver became an accidental encirclement. Orders contradicted each other. Messengers died on roads that no longer belonged to anyone. Armies met at dawn expecting allies, and found enemies just as confused and just as desperate. The battle had no name. It ended with fields burned and no clear victor, only survivors too exhausted to pursue retreating foes. By nightfall, Dragonfire finished what Steel had begun, erasing the battlefield so thoroughly that maps would later argue over where it had taken place. In Valheim, Arion Valthar received casualty lists that no longer fit on parchment. He noticed a pattern others missed. The clashes were not random. They formed corridors, lines of movement shaped not by conquest, but by reaction. Armies moved away from rumored dragon sightings and toward perceived safety, colliding with forces doing the same. Panic herded men into killing grounds. "This war is steering itself," Arion said quietly. His generals argued for decisive action. Strike now before chaos hardened into advantage for rivals. Arion delayed, knowing each order carried consequences that would echo far beyond the battlefield. Leadership, he realized, had become an exercise in choosing which disaster to unleash. Elsewhere, Lyrian Vale crossed what had once been a neutral valley. Now it was a graveyard. She moved carefully through abandoned camps, past shattered wagons and discarded weapons. The dead lay unburied, claimed neither by victors nor mourners. Most bore wounds from behind panic, not courage, had killed them. She found one survivor, a young soldier too injured to flee, too terrified to fight. "They came from everywhere," he whispered. "We didn't know who was who anymore." Lyrian left him water and a blade. It was all she could offer. The war was no longer about sides. It was about survival. In the east, Elmira, Nox confirmed her worst fear. Dragonfire had begun to alter the fabric of the world. Areas repeatedly scorched no longer responded to magic the same way. Spells unraveled. Enchantments decayed. The land itself resisted restoration, as if remembering the fire. This was not temporary devastation. It was permanent change. Elmira documented everything, knowing future generations, if any remained, would need to understand why the world no longer behaved as it once had. In the west, Tharic Ironblood faced his first true test. A coalition of coastal lords, alarmed by his growing influence, united against him. Their fleets blocked key harbors, threatening his supply lines. Diplomacy failed within days. Tharic responded, with speed and brutality. He struck before their alliance could coordinate, smashing one fleet while the others hesitated. The message was clear. Unity delayed was unity destroyed. His reputation spread faster than his armies. Some now feared him more than dragons. High above it all, Kaeldrix observed the widening destruction. He saw men adapt, not wisely but efficiently. He saw fear become doctrine, cruelty justified as necessity. The war had found its rhythm, and it did not require his constant presence. That troubled him more than resistance ever could. Dragons were meant to be the reckoning, not the engine. Yet the engine now ran on human choice, and in the shadow of that realization, the Veiled One watched kingdoms bleed themselves dry, satisfied not by flame, but by momentum. The fronts multiplied. The reasons blurred, and the war, once sparked by a single fire, now fed itself endlessly. The price of choosing the war demanded decisions long before it offered clarity. For weeks, Arion Valthar resisted the pressure to abandon restraint. Valheim's strength had always been its steadiness. its refusal to be drawn into the worst instincts of others. But as fronts multiplied and pleas for aid arrived faster than he could answer them, Arion understood a painful truth. Neutrality was no longer read as wisdom. It was read as weakness. A delegation arrived from a neighboring realm at dusk, lords, with scorched cloaks and hollow eyes. Their city lay exposed, its defenses outdated, its people already fleeing. "We ask for Valheim's banners," their leader said, "not tomorrow, tonight." Arion looked past them toward the city walls, where his soldiers waited in disciplined silence. If he refused, that city would burn. If he agreed, Valheim would become a target, not only for dragons, but for every rival watching for an excuse. This was the choice the war offered. He gave the order. Valheim's banners rode at dawn. South of the Riverlands, Lyrian Vale stood at another crossroads, this one marked by blood. A group of armed men blocked the road ahead, wearing mismatched armor and claiming authority in the name of a distant crown. Behind them lay a town already stripped of supplies. "They'll starve if we take the rest," one of Lyrian's companions whispered. The men demanded surrender of food and weapons. They promised protection. They could not guarantee. Lyrian saw the truth immediately. These were not soldiers. They were survivors who had decided mercy was optional. When negotiations failed, when it ended, bodies lay scattered across the road, some of the men, some of Lyrian's group. She stood shaking, blood on her hands, knowing she had crossed a line she would never uncross. To protect the innocent, she had become something else. In the east, Elmira Nox made her own irreversible decision. She chose to break the last restraint. Deep within a ruined sanctum, she activated a beacon older than any kingdom, a signal meant only for dragons who remembered the first accord. It was not a summons. It was a confession. The world was failing. The balance was gone, and the consequences would be shared. Elmira knew what this meant. Dragons who had slept through centuries would awaken, not to conquer, but to judge whether the world deserved to continue at all. She sealed the sanctum behind her, knowing there would be no forgiveness for this act. In the west, Tharic Ironblood accepted an alliance he knew would collapse. A powerful coastal lord offered ships in exchange for protection and influence. Tharic agreed publicly and privately prepared for betrayal. When it came as expected, he was ready. The coastal fleet burned in harbor, destroyed by its supposed ally before it could strike. Tharic absorbed what remained, his power now undeniable. From that day forward, no one mistook him for a defensive force. He had chosen domination. Above ruined cities and marching armies, Caeldrix felt the world tilt. The choices had been made. Kings had committed. Warriors had hardened. Mages had unleashed truths long buried. There would be no return to what was. Caeldrix understood now that the coming devastation would not be halted by a single act of judgment. The war had grown beyond dragons. It belonged to the world itself, and in the silence between these choices, the Veiled One marked them carefully, not with satisfaction, but with intent. Each decision narrowed the future, carving it into fewer and darker paths. By the end of the season, none of them would recognize the world they had tried to save. The price of choosing had been paid, and the bill was far from settled. The breaking of trust, the war crossed a threshold. Until then, there had still been rules unspoken, fragile but present. Cities were threatened before they were taken. Prisoners were ransomed. Messengers were spared. Alliances, once sworn, were expected to last at least a season. Those rules died quietly. It began with a pact. 3 Midland kingdoms, exhausted and surrounded, signed a mutual defense accord. They pledged troops, shared supply routes, and swore to stand together against both dragonfire and invasion. Their seals were pressed into wax before witnesses. Their banners flew side by side, For 10 days the pact held. On the 11th, one kingdom withdrew its forces under cover of night. At dawn, the remaining two were surrounded. The betrayal was swift and efficient. Gates were opened from within, supply depots burned, before defenders could reach them. By midday, both capitals were lost, not to dragons, but to former allies who now claimed necessity as justification. Word spread faster than fire trust, collapsed everywhere, at once. In Valhem, Arian Valther learned of the betrayal as his forces marched to relieve a besieged city. The request for aid was real. The trap waiting for them was also real. He had seconds to decide, withdraw and doom the city, advance and risk Valhem's army. Arian chose neither. He split his forces, committing just enough to break the siege, while holding the rest in reserve. The maneuver saved the city, but at a cost. His army took losses Valhem could not easily replace. For the first time, Arian felt the weight of command as something corrosive. Victory no longer felt clean. In the south, Lyrian Val arrived too late to prevent another kind of betrayal. A town that had promised shelter turned its gates against her people, fearing retribution from a nearby army. Arrows fell from the walls without warning. Panic tore through the refugees. Lyrian led them away under fire, shielding children with her own body, watching trust die in real time. That night, she burned her old insignia, the last mark tying her to any crown. She would protect people, not banners. In the east, Elmira Nox saw the effects of her beacon. The skies changed. Dragons stirred across distant regions. Their movements felt as pressure in the world's fabric. Some would come to judge. Others would come to claim old grievances. None would come to negotiate. Elmira realized she had not summoned saviors. She had summoned consequences. In the west, Tharic Ironblood used betrayal as doctrine. He spread false treaties, baited rivals into exposing weaknesses, then crushed them with overwhelming force. His armies grew not only through conquest, but through fear-driven defections. Soldiers preferred serving a ruthless commander to dying for a hesitant king. Tharic no longer pretended otherwise. Honor is a luxury of peacetime, he told his generals. We live beyond that now. Above a shattered alliance's burning ruins, Caeldrix watched mortals turn on one another with ruthless efficiency. The dragons had once been blamed for ending ages. Now they were merely witnesses. Caeldrix understood that judgment would come, but not as a single flame. It would come as attrition, as exhaustion, as the slow erosion of everything that had once justified crowns. And in the widening void left by broken oaths, the Veiled One thrived. No whispers were needed now. The world had learned to betray itself. By the time the next fires fell, no kingdom would trust another enough to stand united beneath the sky. The war had shed its last restraints. Ashes without borders, the end did not come as a single catastrophe. It came as many. Across Astarion, fires ignited almost simultaneously, not coordinated by command, but by collapse. Once trust had broken, once restraint had vanished, the war no longer required dragons to escalate. Men did that work themselves. 3 crowns fell within the same week. In the south, a fertile kingdom starved when its allies cut supply routes overnight. Riots consumed its capital before any army arrived. The king was found dead beneath his own throne, crown trampled into the marble floor by fleeing courtiers. In the west, a harbor realm burned as rival fleets turned its docks into a battlefield. Fire spread ship to ship, then city to city. By dawn, the sea itself glowed red. The crown vanished with the tide, lost to molten stone and boiling water. In the north, an Iron Realm fortress, once believed impregnable, fell not to force, but to treachery. A single gate opened at the wrong moment. The battle inside lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the mountain echoed with silence. No dragon had struck any of them. The realization hit too late. In Valheim, Arian Valsar stood before a map that no longer resembled the world he knew. Entire regions were crossed out in ash and ink. Borders blurred, names were scratched away, and replaced with question marks. "We are losing more than territory," one general said quietly. Arian nodded. "We are losing memory." He ordered records copied and hidden, knowing the war would not only destroy cities, but truth itself. If history survived, it would need witnesses who remembered more than victory. Beyond the cities, Lyrian Vale moved through a landscape stripped of allegiance. She encountered bands of fighters who wore no colors, villages that answered to no lord, and children who could not remember which kingdom they had been born in. The war had erased identity as thoroughly as fire erased stone. She began to understand her role. Not as a soldier, not as a leader, but as someone who endured. In the east, Elmira Knox felt the full consequence of her choice. Multiple dragons had awakened. Their movements bent the world, weather shifting unpredictably, coastlines trembling, ancient wards failing one by one. The balance she had hoped to preserve was gone. What remained was judgment distributed unevenly and without mercy. Elmidra wept alone, knowing there would be no undoing this. In the west, Theric Ironblood stood victorious atop conquered ground, surveying an empire formed from fear and necessity. His armies were unmatched, his influence undeniable, and yet, for the first time, doubt touched him. This war could not be ruled. It could only be survived. High above ruined realms, Kaeldrix descended upon a battlefield, already abandoned by the living. He did not burn it. He landed among the ashes, folding his wings as if in mourning. The dragon saw clearly now what mortals had become, not victims of dragon fire, but architects of their own annihilation. The age of crowns was collapsing under its own weight, and in the unseen spaces between events, the Veiled One recorded everything, not names, not victories, only outcomes. By the end of that season, the world no longer asked who started the war. It asked who would still exist when it ended. Fire was everywhere, and there was no path back.